How hot is Kuwait? Today on The Combat Perspective. Thanks for joining me today on The Combat Perspective. Today we're going to talk about how hot Kuwait was. In 2005, I finished basic training, and in November, October 31st, I left to go to my first duty station in Schweinfurt, Germany. I was the 2nd Dagger Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, and we received our orders to go to Iraq by the end of 2005, and we were to deploy in June of 2006. During that time, we were starting to have the ramp up in Iraq, and our brigade was assigned as Quick Reaction Force, or QRF, for all of Iraq. So we deployed to Kuwait. When we got to Kuwait, it was June of 2006, and the average weather in Kuwait in June is about 115 degrees. Growing up in Wisconsin, the hottest I remember it getting is like 91, 92. In basic training in Georgia in 2005 in the summertime, I didn't know it gets that hot, but Kuwait was a whole nother experience. I was talking to a friend of mine who was in the Marine Corps, and I always use the analogy that it feels like a bunch of hair dryers in your face. So I remember as a young private, I was getting off the airplane in Kuwait, just flying from Germany, where in June it's probably 70, maybe 80 degrees in Germany. And when I stepped off the airplane, I thought for sure I was right behind the engine. And I quickly realized I was at the front of the plane, and I could see the nose, and that was just how hot it was. The sun was blinding. It was just pure desert, and it was very hot. And I remember walking down the stairs thinking, oh my God, how am I going to survive this? It's hot. Like a young private, I didn't know any better, so when we flew from Germany to Kuwait, it was a nonstop flight, and I kept all my gear on. When we boarded the plane, we had to wear our Kevlar's, IBA, and everything else, and I was, of course, the person in the middle seat, and I kept my IBA on, which is the body armor, and so right when I stepped out of the airplane, I couldn't believe how hot it was. We took a bus to Camp Beering, Kuwait, and that's where most people go in order to acclimate to the weather in process that you are in a combat zone. Do some minor training, counter IED training, how to spot IEDs. You do a convoy live fire and a few other training type events to prepare you for combat. But for us, it was a little different because once again, our brigade was going to be the quick reaction force for all Iraq. So the intent there was if things got bad in a certain spot, that's where we were going to deploy. We were broken up. Our brigade was broken up into 3 task force. Task Force 177, Task Force 126, and Task Force 118. Task Force 126 is the infantry. Task Force 118 was the infantry. Task Force 177 was an armored task force. So in Germany, we were mechanized, which means we have tanks, we have big vehicles. We weren't what's called light infantry. And everyone going to Iraq is being trained how to be light infantry because a lot of times you just can't always roll around the city in tanks and armored vehicles. And while that was occurring, our task force was broken up, and each a few companies from each task force is intermingled. So in our task force, we had Bravo 126, I believe it was Charlie 118. We had the main headquarters of 177 Armored. We had my section of the Mortars and Scouts. And then a few of our sister task forces would have a tank company assigned to them, and so on and so forth. So as we're getting acclimated in Kuwait, it's important that you condition the body for that type of heat. And as a young private, all I knew is I was stuck in Kuwait. It was really hot, and I just wanted to find out where we were going because we didn't know at the time. And so the rumors were we were going to either Baghdad or Ramadi. Once again, Ramadi during that time was considered the worst place in Iraq. Baghdad was definitely ramping up, but we were just finishing the Battle of Fallujah, the Battle of Ramadi. Hit was a really bad area, and so that little triangle of death was where we were focused on. And I always kid around with my Marine friends that they owned that area, Ramadi, Fallujah, and everything else, and the Army had to go bail them out because they couldn't hold it. And so I always like to poke fun of my Marine buddies. And so we were there for roughly 2 months, maybe a little bit longer than 2 months in Kuwait. And I remember a few training events that kind of stuck with me. The first one was we would go on just a march, and our marches would be about 2 miles, and we would just keep our body armor, our helmet, knee pads, elbow pads, eye pro, ear pro, and our weapon, which is pretty much the bare basics of going out into a combat situation. So we didn't have a ruck, we didn't have an assault bag, we weren't carrying extra ammo. We were just carrying our combat load, and instantaneously you'd be sweating nonstop to the point where you stop sweating, right? So if you know anything about heat casualties, and you get taught this in the military, again and again and again, reoccurring, because one of the killers is heat exhaustion, heat stroke, if you don't condition the body right. So we would stop sweating and start getting prickly heat, and it was just miserable. But at the end of the marches, especially in the first week or two, when we were walking into the barracks, and once again it's 115 or so outside, there's no shade anywhere. There's always a constant breeze from the desert blowing on you. Sandstorms every once in a while. Sand's getting everywhere. And when I get inside the barracks, it would be 80, 85 degrees, which felt like it was Alaska. And a few times, I would start blacking out. I would barely get to my cot by the time, my vision was completely gone, even though I know my eyes were open, and I was just ready to pass out. We had a few people who tried to be slick, and in their camelback, which is a bladder that would be filled with water, you'd be drinking water, they would put energy drinks in there or pop, and they would quickly fall out because they're not drinking enough. So it wasn't till August we got to Ramadi. So we spent June, July, and I think the first week of August in Kuwait. And all you had to do in Kuwait was train, eat, and wait. Train, eat, and wait. And that's all you did all the time. So some of our training that we did, like I said before, was how to spot an IED. And you would go through a course of what is being used currently in theater, what they look like. You would drive in vehicles and try to spot them while driving, because you're not always going to be on a foot patrol. If you're driving 30 miles an hour, can you spot a roadside bomb before it explodes? convoy live fire, where you drive through a mock city and all of a sudden pop-up targets pop up and you start engaging the enemy that way. Call for fire. A lot of medical courses. So I went through a course called the Black Hawk First Responder, which was just a way to train non-medics how to do, I'd say, routine tasks, but it was more of a little bit more of the life-saving tasks. So needle chest decompression, how to insert a trach, how to do the nasopharyngely. Let's see what else. How to cut an emergency. What's it called? A breathing spot in your neck. A craniotomy. One of those. To stuffing wounds. Anything from gunshot blast to facial blast. How to pretty much sustain a body after an injury, a severe injury, right? Trauma. And so a lot of that training, a lot of repetitiveness. But it was hot in Kuwait. As I'm talking, if you're listening to the podcast, you're not seeing the photos that I'm putting up right now. But this is what our routine was. I think Kuwait was maybe the hottest. When we got to Ramadi, it was a different type of heat. It was Ramadi was more of we were right on the banks of the Euphrates, so there was a lot of humidness in the air, but there is zero precipitation, absolutely none. And the crazy thing about the desert, if you haven't experienced desert life before, 115 degrees during the day, and like 75 degrees, 70 degrees during the night. And that fluctuation makes people sick. It messes with you a lot. And it was just so miserable in Kuwait. It's so hot. It's actually kind of funny how warm it is and seeing how people react to that. But that was my first experience in Kuwait. It was extremely hot. It was a good way to shed a lot of weight. A lot of people start getting fit, start working out before they go across, but it's one of those stopping points that you need to do in order to acclimate a little bit, especially someone going from a Germany cold climate into that type of heat. If you don't have a good handoff, or if you don't have a good plan to acclimate and then transition, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And so, how hot is it in Kuwait? It's this hot. 115 degrees, no shade, constant breeze, constant dust. It's miserable. The first time in Kuwait, the second time in Kuwait wasn't bad because we were only there for 5-6 days, but spending 2.5 months there, and anyone who is stationed there for a year, 9 months, who never made it across the border to Iraq, I feel sorry for you guys. That was miserable. All right. Thanks for joining me on the Combat Perspective.